the Bachelor of Education programs, the consecutive, which means that the students come to us already having a degree. So they range in age from 20 years old and up. In our Indigenous Bachelor of Education program, it's a concurrent program, 5 years. So they come to us to start their undergraduate degree. And so they can be fresh out of high school and be as young as 17. I am strong about experiential learning, land-based learning. I like to engage my students in ways that they can connect to the learning on a personal level. And so, and then the learning becomes kind of rich and meaningful that way. So, examples of that are in our teacher education program, for example. I take groups of students with me every year on the land for 12 days with me, land and water, and they learn about Indigenous peoples through the land. Because when I think about how to best serve predominantly non-Indigenous people about Indigenous education, I know that I can take them the furthest in the shortest amount of time on the land. And so I started this alternative settings placement with this, which is this 12 days on the land with me, and we just engage with the land in all kinds of meaningful and personally connected ways. And because the worldview of Indigenous peoples is a direct reflection of the natural world, then it's a great way to learn about who we are as Indigenous people on the inside. I want to get beyond the material culture, which is the stuff that you see or can come to know about us on the outside. I want teachers to move beyond teaching just about the stuff you can see, such as showing a map and saying this is where they lived, these are the clothes that they wore, these are the houses that they lived in, this is the art that they made, and that's all good stuff to learn about, but we need to get to the culture that is embedded within those. And so learning about our worldview is learning about who we are on the inside, and then that's reflected out into the material culture that you can then study as well. Certainly, other things that we have done in our mainstream Bachelor of Education program, we recognize that, most of our students coming to us, despite the fact that they have an undergraduate degree, still know very little about Indigenous peoples in Canada and their experience. So we've instituted a number of initiatives to kind of help build that foundation of knowledge so that they can then take that and begin thinking about what does that then mean for education. So some of the things that we do there is we have all of our teacher candidates watch the Eighth Fire CBC documentary series. And they do that before they even come to our program. It's kind of like pre-homework. And then they're in a discussion group when they arrive to kind of talk about what they watched and what they learned. We follow that up with the blanket activity. So all of our first year students participate in the blanket activity. Again, it's a very interactive, experiential activity where they learn about the colonization of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And then we have in our program, for example, 2 core texts that we use because we want our faculty to infuse Indigenous knowledge across all the courses that we teach in our program, because that is what the ministry is expecting. They're expecting all teachers, all grades, all subjects to do this work. So we have a core text for our primary junior teachers and a core text for our intermediate senior teachers. And these are our texts, which I think are great examples of kind of best practice or ways to do infusion work. And so they kind of use that as a text throughout all the courses that they take in the program. One of the things that I always strive to do and that I've seen to be effective is trying to make that kind of head to heart connection for students, which is why I always try to make the learning personally meaningful or personally connected in some way. And so, particularly when we're learning about Indigenous education, for non-Indigenous people, it can be far removed from their experience, right? They don't have the lived experience of being an Indigenous person. So, in some ways, it becomes a bit challenging as an educator to try and get them to kind of understand at a really deep level what that experience has been like, and the implications or the effects that still exist today that we have to deal with. So, for example, I tell my teacher candidates all the time that, it's very difficult to engage Indigenous parents in education. It's actually, it could actually be that you have a parent who simply cannot get through the door of a school because of our history with education, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of mistrust that still exists, right? So, ideas like that, in some ways kind of blow their mind because they're like, what? Like, I don't get it. And so, uh, it takes a lot of work to kind of help them to understand those kinds of concepts. I still go into schools, for example, working with kids, and I'm teaching them about residential schools, and I still have kids who look at me and say, that's not true, you're lying, right? Because it's so beyond their reality that they can't even imagine that could happen, right? So you're kind of up against this gap of the Indigenous experience and then the non-Indigenous experiences. So and so I use strategies to kind of help make that connection happen. And one of the ways that I find that effective is to use kind of like what I call simulation learning. It's kind of like what some people would say experiential learning. It's very similar to how the blanket activity operates, right? It's like they're putting you through this experience and you're having to imagine it for yourself. And, so for example, I've created a list of 10 statements about, our colonization as Indigenous peoples, and the student is asked to imagine this happening to them right now, right? And it gets to their heart because it's me, I'm going through this now. And so they make a very strong emotional connection to that. And when I always say, when my students are feeling, I know that they're learning. You can't not learn when you're feeling. And so I try to get my students to that place of feeling. But using that as a best practice, comes with a degree of caution as well. And I teach my teachers this as well, in that, when we are trying to get that heart and head connection happening, you are opening people up to their emotions, and you have to be able to handle that when it happens in the classroom, right? So education, I believe, is a healing act, and because we're doing healing work, we have to be almost trained as healers too, teachers as healers, and so I challenge my teachers to keep themselves well, to be healthy, holistically healthy, because they have to bring their best selves into the classroom, and to be in such a way that they can handle the emotions that happen. I mean, education is about human beings. We're educating human beings, and as human beings, we have feelings, and we have to be able to handle that in the classroom and not be afraid of that kind of happening in the classroom, and be able to deal with it when it does. And in our program, we have evaluation systems in place, right? So our students evaluate each individual course when they're done, and then we also have a program evaluation that they do at the end of the program. So we get a fair amount of feedback, I think, from our students. But and so that, that's certainly information that I use to guide my work. I guess for me personally, I I feel like I've done my job when students have those kind of aha moments or kind of critical moments when they go, I get it, right? I get it. Um, and then even when they bring it that one step further, so their awareness has been opened up or they have more understanding, but when they take that and then they apply it to, their assignments, for example, so they take what they've learned and they move it into a really awesome unit plan, right? Where they've um, really made sense of what they've learned and put it into action. That I like to see that tells me, like, yeah, wow, you really get it, right? um, Certainly there's always those personal moments again when um, when students have those deep personal connections, and and they're they share that with the group, and so it becomes um, awareness for all of us about, kind of where that activity or where that experience kind of took them. um, in some ways those experiences are so powerful that they can't even really write them out in an evaluation. They'll often say there's no words to describe. You know what I mean? And so we can't get that kind of stuff necessarily on evaluation forms, but I'm privileged with being able to see that in them, either in the moment or perhaps as a consolidation when it all kind of comes together for them. um, so those are good things for me to see. I feel like, you know, um, that how I go about the work that I do works, and that I am making a difference. Wow, I can vision big.
Well, go for it.
Well, it's certainly. I mean, I'm always thinking about it because I work in education. But interestingly, over the past little while, I've been thinking about it on another level because, um, I've done a lot of work and reflected on my own experience as an Indigenous person that was public schooled, and then I have my own children, and I didn't feel that the public school system was that much different from what I experienced, and I wanted something different for my kids, right? So I opened and I operated an Anishinaabe culture-based school for them, right? And and then I come back into working in public education and teacher education and all of that stuff to again to try and make change at that level. I'm thinking about my grandchildren, right? As I'm kind of moving into that grandmotherhood stage of my life, and I've been questioning, is it any different? And while I have seen some great change, you know, over the past 5 or so years, I've seen a lot of really good things happen. I still feel like there's still so much work left to do, and and ideally, I would love to see um, a public education system that that was for all students. Like, so where not just Indigenous students, but all students could go to school and feel acknowledged, validated, and celebrated every day of their schooling. um, we're not there yet, and I don't know how quickly we can get there. It's like it never moves fast enough for me, right? And so what do we do in the meantime then? I still don't understand why there is not an Indigenous school board system in Ontario. I mean, the Catholic people have one, right? And so, as the First Peoples, um, why can't we have something like that? I think that would provide an instant space for Indigenous kids, right? And some people would argue and say, well, that's segregation. Why would you segregate kids? And I certainly had that um, question posed to me when I opened my school because it was for Indigenous kids. And to me, it's not segregation. To me, it's about providing our kids with what they need in the moment if it's not accessible anywhere else. Um, and just because we're learning in a culture based space doesn't mean that those kids aren't don't know how to relate to other people or that we're kind of creating some kind of monster, right? Because I can tell you that the kids in my school, um, when they went back into public school, I had teachers and principals, make a point of telling me, I can't believe what wonderful people they are. They're so happy, and they get along with everybody. And when they came into the school, they just rolled right in like they'd always been there. They didn't rock the boat, you know. And so, so I don't know. I'd really like great change to happen in the education system, but if that isn't going to happen soon enough, then I think we as Indigenous peoples need to provide those spaces for our kids. I mean, I know we do in our First Nation communities, but what about all the kids who don't live in a First Nation community, right? They need they need an education system that works for them. It's designed for them and is delivered for them.